This week we're going to look at how to create shadows. I've created a light here, basically continuing from where we left off in the last movie. I have this shadows project. You'll find in the chapter 17 folder if you'd like to follow along. And you can see that we have this light and what it's doing as it's shining this light. You can see that the stuff that's not in the light is getting blocked out in darkness, but we're still not casting any shadows. Now, before we proceed, I just want to point out that these vertical wings here, these gray and black wings, they're not being affected by this light whatsoever. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, it's a 2D layer, but actually, if we look at this layer, it is a 3D layer, in fact. We could even position this layer at different places in Z-space, and we could see it interacting with other layers going in front of and behind them. So we know it's a 3D layer. I'm just going to undo those changes there. But the thing is that this layer is a nested composition. We'll talk about nested compositions a little bit later on in this training series, but basically it's made up of a series of layers. And those layers have effects applied to them. And some effects, like the ones applied here, such as fill, which is filling these areas with a solid color, they do not respond to lights. So if you wanted the wings to have this exact look and respond to lights, you would need to render them out with transparency, re-import them back in, and then replace this original layer with the new graphic. So, moral of the story, just plan ahead while you're doing your work and applying effects and setting up your projects. Now, getting back to creating shadows here, I open up the light layer, open up light options. When you're creating shadows, you actually need to go through a few steps. So I'm going to go to the light options area in the light layer, and I'm going to go across from cast shadows, and I'm going to click off to on. Now that didn't do anything. So what we have to do is go down to, let's say for example, one of these layers, say the rock logo layer, open this up, open up material options. And then under material options, which basically material options refer to how this layer responds and reacts to light, I'm going to change cast shadows to on. And now we are casting some shadows. Now this looks really terrible because this light's kind of point blank. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my view to the top view. And I'm going to zoom back out. And I'm going to click this light here. And I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to zoom pretty far out here. There we go. So now the light is much farther away from this rock logo layer. It should look a little bit better. Let's take the view back to active camera. And so now as we zoom back in, you could see that that's where the light is basically affecting the shadows here. So we move the light around. Looks a little better than before. Now, I still might want to tweak these shadows. They are a little intense. To do that, we can go back up to the light, open up light options, and we can adjust the shadow darkness. This is essentially like an opacity setting for the shadow. Shadow diffusion is like a blur for the shadow. So by blurring it and reducing its opacity a little bit, we can create a much softer effect. This certainly looks a lot less muddy than it did before. And keep in mind too that we could animate this light. We could animate this moving around and thus create this cool parallax effect with the shadow. We need to change cast shadows from off to on in order to get those to work. They also need to be turned on for each individual layer. If you're still having problems, adjust the light position. Sometimes the angle that the light is coming from really makes a difference on whether or not it's casting a shadow or whether you can see the shadow. Sometimes your light might actually be behind the layers, and maybe from the active camera view it looks like everything should work, but if you go back into the top view, for example, you might see that the light's nowhere near your layers. If that doesn't work, you can come down to the material options of a given layer and make sure that the accept lights value is on, and also that the accepts shadows value is on. These layers allow you to adjust which 3D layers are affected by lights and shadows and which ones aren't. So that concludes our basic look at the 3D features in After Effects. As you can tell, it's a big world. It's amazing how complicated it gets by just adding one small little dimension. But basically, you know now, after looking at this chapter, the core techniques for working with 3D files or creating 3D projects in After Effects.